Good evening and welcome to the IOE professorial lecture. At our speaker's request, we're not wearing academic gowns to make it less formal. But this is a very important and happy event, and I'm very, very delighted to introduce today's speaker. By the way, I'm Li Wei, I'm the Director and Dean of IOE. I'm really happy to be here to chair this event. Our speaker today is Professor Chloë Marshall. Also, I should add, we are joined by BSL interpreters, Karen and Esther. Thank you very much for being here. This evening's event is entitled Acquiring Language in Challenging Circumstances, and our speaker is Professor Chloë Marshall, Professor of Psychology, Language and Education in IOE's Department of Psychology and Human Development. Chloë has a very interesting background. She studied biology, Montessori education, linguistics, and psychology. She started out as a nursery teacher and teacher trainer, which piqued her interest in young children's language and early literacy development. She subsequently gained a master's in linguistics and a PhD in human communication science here at IOE. She then did postdoctoral research at UCL, in fact, her degrees. And she did her postdoctoral research in UCL, followed by a lectureship in City. I think that's where we first met. She contributed to the training of speech-language therapists at City and was awarded a prestigious Liverhume Trust Early Career Fellowship. Chloë then joined the IOE in 2011 as senior lecturer. She was promoted to reader in 2013 and professor in 2017. Her research spans language and literacy development, and in particular the specific difficulties faced by children with dyslexia, specific language impairment, and children who are deaf. Chloë is equally passionate about teaching, and at IOE has led programs in psychology, special and inclusive education, and educational neuroscience, alongside doctoral supervision, winning a couple of awards in the process. She is also a leader and advocate, including as director of IOE's Center for Language, Literacy and Numeracy Research and Practice, director of ALLIC, Acquiring Language and Literacy in Challenging Circumstances Lab, and also as editor-in-chief of a very important journal, First Language. And recently, she's been examining how to make scientific publishing more inclusive, and that's a very important venture. Chloë, thank you for being here and being part of our professorial lecture series. And now I invite you to present your lecture.
Thank you, Li Wei. Good evening, everyone. I am touched to be looking out at the faces of so many colleagues, students, and friends. Thank you for being here this evening, and thank you everybody who's joining on the live stream. So this is my inaugural lecture, but as some of you know, I am retiring at the end of August. So this is doubling as my retirement lecture, and therefore it's an opportunity for me to look back not just on the work that I've done to get my promotion to professor, but it's a chance for me to look back on my career and to reflect on my time in academia. Alongside telling you a little bit about my research, I'm hoping that there are two themes that I'll be able to convey this evening. The first theme is the great joy that working with colleagues and students has brought me. They are the aspect of the job I'm going to miss the most when I retire. And the second theme that I want to convey is the value of serendipity in science. I've never had a 5-year plan for research. I used to dread it in my annual development review when the question, Chloë, what is your 5-year plan for research, would come up, because I didn't have one. I've been fortunate that I've worked with many people in unplanned and unexpected ways, and serendipity has served me well. It is customary at both inaugural and retirement lectures to have a slide with a long list of names of all the people I've collaborated with in order to acknowledge their contributions. And I'm not going to do that for the simple reason that I'm genuinely fearful of missing somebody out by mistake. I've collaborated with a lot of people. And I've also been lucky to have exceptional thinkers critique my work and offer me feedback that's enhanced my work. So if I'm grateful to you for the support that you've given me in my career, the way that you've shaped my career, I will have told you before tonight. There are, however, two sets of acknowledgements that I do want to give. So my first degree was in biology, but I could equally well have studied languages. I loved languages. I had learnt French as a kid in Paris. And when I came back to school in the UK, I enjoyed learning Latin and ancient Greek. And in my first job as a Montessori teacher, I became fascinated by the great strides in language development that the kids in my class were making. They would start with me at the age of 2, often not saying very much. And by the time they went to big school at the age of 4 or 5, they were little chatterboxes and they were well on their way to learning how to read and write. I was fascinated by this. But I was also fascinated by the few children in my class who weren't making quite the expected levels of progress that I would have expected. And what I wanted was a scientific explanation for children's language development, and I didn't know where to turn. And then in 1996, a friend gave me a book by Steven Pinker called The Language Instinct. And this book blew my mind. Because for the first time, I realized that language was part of human biology and it could be studied as a science. And then a few years later, I read a book by Geoffrey Miller called The Mating Mind, which presented a view of language and the mind, again within human biology, with an evolutionary explanation. And I thought, right, I need to study this more. So I came to UCL in 2000 to study for a master's in linguistics, with the aim of going back into the classroom, with the aim of being a better teacher with my newfound knowledge. And I never made it back into the classroom. And that's because in my second week, I attended a lecture given by the most wonderful professor, Heather van der Lely. And she was presenting her research, which was on the language difficulties that adolescents with what in those days we termed specific language impairment, but these days we would call it developmental language disorder, DLD for short. And she was talking about sorts of difficulties that her children had. And it was a really difficult lecture. I only understood one word in 2, if that. But I could see the similarities between the difficulties that she was talking about in her children and the sorts of language structures that the children in my class had been sometimes having difficulties in mastering. I could see those similarities. And so after her lecture, I went up to her and I said, I think your work is fantastic. And I want to do a PhD with you. And this just came out of nowhere because I hadn't gone back to university with the intention of doing a PhD. I mean, I couldn't afford it. I had a mortgage. But there was something about her that was so inspirational. And very kindly, she had a couple of meetings with me to discuss my ideas. And she took me on as a PhD student. And we carried on working together long after my PhD. We really enjoyed working together, I think not least because we shared a love of good food and good wine. And this photograph shows us in Paris. Heather had a short sabbatical visiting our collaborator, Frank Rameau. And I went over for 24 hours to celebrate the publication of a big paper. The three of us were really excited at this paper, so I went over for a superb meal. And this is Heather and me on our way to the restaurant. Now, Heather very sadly died shortly afterwards in 2014. But this is how I like to remember her. We're on our way to a fabulous meal of fine dining and scientific conversation. And that's the best sort of evening. So why did I decide to study language acquisition? Well, as I told you, I had an interest in languages. I was fascinated by the language development of the pupils in my class. But language is just inherently fascinating, and it's so valuable. It's really difficult to imagine how we could maintain friendships, how we could learn anything at school without language. I would say that it is our species' greatest achievement. And indeed, we know that individuals with language difficulties do tend to have poorer outcomes with respect to education, with respect to employment, with respect to health. So we need language. And intellectually, our instinct for acquiring language is one of the greatest puzzles in human biology. So it's fascinating to study. I've worked on several different topics, many different research projects during my time in academia. If I had to find a unifying theme, What I would say is that I'm interested in the challenges that people face when they acquire languages. Now, those challenges might be due to the structure of language itself. They might be due to constraints on the learner. I've picked 4 projects that I'm going to tell you about this evening. I'll just give you a moment to read those off the screen. So much of my work is focused on phonology. And if we're thinking about spoken languages, phonology is the sounds of language, and it's the rules for putting those sounds together into words and phrases. And if we're thinking about sign languages, then phonology is the configuration, the movements, the locations of the hands, and again, the rules for combining those into words and phrases. So let me tell you first of all about my PhD research. I started my PhD with Heather at UCL in 2001. And this was a really exciting time to be working in linguistics and a really exciting time to be thinking about why certain children might be having language difficulties. Stephen Pinker had just published another book, a wonderful book called Words and Rules, which was seemingly about the fact that English has 2 types of verbs in the past tense. So one set of verbs, regular verbs, take the suffix that we spell as ed in their past tense form, forms like jumped. And another set of verbs, like stand and teach, are much less predictable and much more varied in the phonology of their past tense forms. Stood, taught, dug, swam, saw, and so on. But this book was about a lot more than just the English past tense. It was presenting a model of language and a model of the human mind more generally as comprising 2 sets of mental processes. One set of mental processes is rule-based, exemplified by the regular past tense form in English, like jumped. And the other set is memory-based, exemplified by the fact that irregular past tense verbs in English are so unpredictable that they need to be stored, they need to be memorized, and they need to be retrieved from memory. So computation versus lookup, as it were. And Heather and her colleague Michael Ullman and various other researchers had found that children with developmental language disorder, DLD, had difficulties producing English past tense verbs. Actually, that was the case for both regulars and irregulars, but it was particularly the regular verbs that children with DLD had difficulty with. And Heather interpreted this finding as indicating that children with DLD had an impairment in the use of a regular suffixation rule, in the use of this ed rule that adds a past tense suffix to a verb form. So children with DLD were more likely to say something like, yesterday I jump, instead of yesterday I jumped. So she interpreted her data within the words and rules theory, but she also used her data to support the words and rules theory. Now, not everybody agreed with this. Some researchers argued that actually the difficulty wasn't a grammatical difficulty at all. It wasn't a difficulty using the suffixation rule. What children with DLD had was an auditory processing deficit. And this auditory processing difficulty affected their phonology. That t suffix at the end of jumped is very brief. If you don't process it, you're not going to learn it, you're not going to be able to use it accurately. And so what looks like a grammatical difficulty is actually a difficulty with phonology. I hope I've explained that clearly. But I came to my PhD thinking, well, why can't it be both? Why can't it be the case that children with DLD do have a difficulty with regular suffixation, with the use of this suffixation rule, but also difficulty with phonological complexity, and particularly difficulty where the inflected verb end is phonologically complex, where you've got a big cluster of consonants at the end of something like jumped, that mt cluster. Those sorts of verbs should be harder than verbs like paid or stayed, where you don't have a cluster at the verb end. And for verbs in the middle with a 2-consonant cluster, like robbed or missed, the accuracy there would depend on the frequency of the cluster. Let me explain that in more detail. So in a verb like robbed, that bd cluster, you don't really get at the ends of English words. It's what we call phonotactically illegal, and it's very rare. Whereas the cluster at the end of a verb like missed, st, is very common in English words. We have it in words like wrist or most or jest. You'll be able to think of your own words. There are lots of them. So if children with DLD are not able to use a suffixation rule, and if they're having to rely on the storage, the memorization of those past tense forms, those forms with an illegal, very rare cluster are going to be stored less accurately than those forms with a very frequent, legal cluster. So missed should be produced more accurately than robbed. Some of you are nodding at me, so I hope I've explained that correctly. So what we did was we employed an elicitation task of the sort that is widely used in acquisition research. In this particular setup, we had two dogs, two toy dogs. We had Kipper and we had Beandog. And Kipper was the leader, and Beandog wanted to do everything that Kipper did. And I would provide a lead into the child, something like, yesterday Kipper robbed a post office. Every day I rob a post office. Yesterday I... And the child would have to take on the voice of Beandog and say something like, yesterday I robbed a post office. I'm aware that when I explain it out of context, it must seem an incredibly strange task. But in context, when children are doing it, they do actually seem to enjoy it and to understand it, even if they don't always produce the past tense form correctly. So what did we find? Well, we replicated Heather's previous work. We found that children with DLD did have huge difficulties with regular past tense inflection. But that phonological complexity also had an impact, so they were less accurate on these forms like jumped, most accurate on forms like paid, and for those forms in the middle, it was indeed verbs like robbed, with that very rare illegal cluster that were produced less accurately than forms like missed, with the legal, more frequent cluster. Why does any of this matter, you might be asking? Well, I think it matters for both theoretical reasons and practical reasons. It matters for theoretical reasons because it just goes to show that language production is incredibly complex. There are lots of different factors involved. And if our theoretical models don't take into account that complexity, they're not doing a good job of accounting for the data. They do not have good empirical coverage. So models need to take these complex data into account. But they're also important for practical reasons. And I think they're important because they give us some indication of what we might target in diagnosis and in language intervention. And I'll explain a little bit more about that on the next slide. So coming up to date, to 2023, what do we know now about this topic? Well, other researchers have replicated our findings. So Nick Riches, for example, has investigated phonological complexity and phonotactics, and he's got similar findings to ours and has drawn similar conclusions. With respect to language intervention, Amanda Owen Van Horn and her colleagues have done some really interesting work delivering interventions for past tense forms. They've used two types of verbs: hard verbs, which are phonologically complex, the jumped type, but also semantically complex, less frequent, and easy verbs, which are simpler phonologically and more common. And they contrasted two different sequences for intervention, starting with hard verbs and then moving to easy, or starting with easy verbs and then moving to hard. And maybe counterintuitively, children actually do better on the hard verbs first, then moving to the easy verbs. So phonology matters for intervention. However, I think it's fair to say that there is less interest in this area of research nowadays. That's probably because theoretically people are less interested in past tense inflection. But also in terms of therapy, children with DLD have many more pressing problems and difficulties with past tense inflection. Speech and language therapy time is incredibly valuable. Let's focus it elsewhere. So after I finished my PhD in 2004, I was fortunate enough to be able to carry on working with Heather. I went on to do postdoctoral research with her and with Frank Ramu. And we were very interested in the co-occurrence of DLD and dyslexia. So what we knew at that stage was that many children who have dyslexia also have the language difficulties characteristic of DLD. And many children with DLD also have the reading difficulties that are characteristic of dyslexia. We didn't really know why that was. I mean, certainly language is very important for reading. So we know from the very famous simple view of reading that reading for meaning requires both recognizing the words on the page and the ability to decode those words that we don't yet recognize. but it also requires the ability to understand those words, both individually and when they're combined into sentences. So language is clearly involved in reading, but we didn't really understand the co-occurrence between these two disorders. And then in 2004, Dorothy Bishop and Maggie Snowling published a really excellent and very influential paper. And what they argued in this paper was that children with DLD and dyslexia share an underlying phonological impairment, and this gives rise to the reading difficulties. But the children with DLD have, in addition, grammatical difficulties, semantic difficulties that give rise to this broader language disorder. There was a lot that we loved about that paper, but there were two implications that arose from their model that we didn't agree with. One was that children with DLD were predicted then to all have dyslexia, and children with DLD and dyslexia were predicted to have the same sorts of phonological difficulties, and we didn't think either of those was the case. So we wanted to look at phonology in more detail, and we wanted to do it in a way that was more linguistically informed than had been the case up to that point. So that's what we did. So our research questions were, quite simply, do all children with DLD have dyslexia? And do children with DLD and dyslexia have the same or different phonological impairments? And our predictions were that we would find a group of DLD without dyslexia, that the phonological impairments in these two groups would not be identical, and that children in which DLD and dyslexia co-occurred, this DLD plus dyslexia group, they would have the phonological impairments of both groups. So we went about recruiting children from specialist schools and specialist units, and we administered a very large battery of language tests looking at vocabulary, at grammar, and a particularly large set of tests looking at phonology, because that was what we were particularly interested in. And first of all, we were able to find a group of children who did just have DLD. So they could recognize words, they could decode words. They were not dyslexic, but they couldn't necessarily understand what they were reading. So we had our three groups, and we also had a group of children who didn't have any identified language or literacy difficulties. They acted as our comparison group. And what we found was an incredibly complicated picture. Maybe this won't surprise you. In trying to make sense of the widespread phonological impairments that we found in the children with dyslexia and the children with DLD, what we argued is that in the children just with dyslexia, the phonological impairment appears to be just in phonological processing. So it seems like the phonological representations themselves are not impaired, but it's that real-time use in language comprehension and language production that is affected in dyslexia. In children with DLD, the picture was very mixed, but we argued that children had a difficulty both with representations and with the processing of those representations. And the children in which the two disorders co-occurred had very severe phonological impairments across the board. Now, it is incredibly difficult experimentally to tease apart representations from processing. But to the extent that we could do it, I think we're onto something, because other work by Frank Ramu has drawn similar conclusions, and more recent work by Iris Berendt has also drawn those same conclusions. Why does any of this matter? Well, I think it matters because what it suggests is that the developmental pathways for dyslexia and DLD are not identical. And it also matters because if we want to intervene at that underlying cognitive level, at the level of phonology, we might be looking to intervene in different ways if those impairments are different. Coming back up to date to 2023, what do we know? Well, this is still a very active area of research. There's a growing recognition both in research but also in the classroom that language really matters for reading and indeed for writing. But we are still a very long way off from being able to map out developmental pathways for language and literacy in terms of genes, neural circuits, brain, cognition, behavior, You know, when I embarked on my postdoc, this is what we were aiming to put together. And the more we learn, the more complex we realize it is. But then that's science, isn't it? So now I need to go back a little bit in my career timeline. I need to take you back to May 2004, to the Manchester Phonology meeting. And I was presenting some of my PhD work on phonology in adolescents with DLD. And Gary Morgan, who is a sign language expert, was presenting some of his research on how deaf children acquire BSL, British Sign Language. And at that stage, I knew very, very little about sign language phonology. But in Gary's talk, he was talking about things that I recognized. He was talking about notions of phonological complexity, markedness, features, phonological errors. And so after Gary's talk, I ran up to him and I said, Gary, we need to work together. We need to do this and this and this. And have you thought about whether you could find DLD in deaf children who are learning to sign? And we could look at this by doing this, that, and the other. And poor Gary, it was quite the verbal onslaught. But he very kindly said, yes, let's do it. And so we did. And so we started one of my happiest collaborations. We did indeed study developmental language disorder in deaf signers. And that's a piece of work that I'm incredibly proud of because we were one of the first groups to do that. But I'm not going to talk about that work this evening. The project I'm going to tell you about is a project that we started a little bit later in 2010, together with a lot of colleagues based at the Deafness, Cognition and Language Research Centre, DCAL, at UCL. And in this project, we were interested in examining the executive functions of deaf children and the relationship between executive functions and language. So I need to explain to you what executive functions are. So executive functions, EFs for short, are a really important set of cognitive functions for learning, because those are the aspects of cognition that we use in order to achieve our goals and to regulate our behavior. So executive functions include things like working memory, flexibility of thinking, self-regulation. Really important for the classroom. They were a hot topic then, they're a hot topic now. There was a little bit of research on EF development in deaf children, and what this research tended to show was that deaf children were delayed in their EF development. And there were two schools of thought as to why that was. So one school of thought was that auditory experience scaffolds the development of EFs. So for deaf children whose auditory experience is not normal, is atypical, they will have delayed executive function development. And we didn't buy that. We thought, well, it's not just auditory experience that deaf children don't experience. A lot of deaf children don't experience good quality language because they're not getting good quality spoken language through their cochlear implant or their hearing aid, and most deaf children are not getting good quality exposure to sign language. So we favored the language deprivation hypothesis, that the reason why deaf children tended to be delayed in executive function development was because of a language delay, not because they were deaf. So we needed to test that. And so we tested that by asking a very basic research question: what is the developmental relationship between language and executive functions in deaf and hearing children? And our predictions were that it would be language development that drove executive function development, and that importantly, deaf children with strong language skills would not have a delay in their executive function development. So that was our research question and our predictions. So we carried out a large-scale longitudinal study of, over 150 children, I think, deaf and hearing, primary school age. Importantly, in our deaf group, we had native signers, so children who were growing up with BSL in the home, children who were learning sign a little bit later at school, and children who were using oral and written language as their main form of language. And we had a battery of language tasks, which the deaf children could choose to do in BSL or in spoken English or in sign-supported English, SSE, if they wanted to. And importantly, our many EF tasks were non-verbal in nature, so they shouldn't have negatively impacted on children with poorer language skills. What did we find? Well, we found great variability in language and EF, both in the hearing and in the deaf children. Much greater variability than we would have expected given that wide range in age. We found that, indeed, overall, deaf children had lower executive function skills compared to hearing children, but this wasn't a function of their deafness, it was a function of their language. This difference between the deaf and the hearing children was mediated by language skills, and over time, it was growth in language skills that drove executive function development, and not the other way around. So it wasn't executive function development that was driving language. And importantly, those deaf children who had early exposure to sign language had age-appropriate EF development, so they didn't have an executive function delay. Why does any of this matter? It matters for the very simple reason that deaf children need language. Many deaf children, most deaf children, do not have access to the language that they would learn most easily, which in this country is BSL. Deaf children need exposure to a visual language, not just for language's sake, but because it supports the development of other areas, like executive functions. What do we know in 2023? Well, gratifyingly, there is much more evidence in support of the language deprivation hypothesis than there is in support of the auditory scaffolding hypothesis. There's been work in lots of different countries, using different research methods, using different research designs, all coming to this conclusion. And that's really important because replication is vital in science. And so all this work leads to this conclusion, which I'm going to stress again, because I think out of all things I've done in my career, this is the most important conclusion. Deaf children need language, and they need language input that is accessible to them. That means they need sign language input. So now I need to take you back again in my timeline to set up the last project that I'm going to tell you about. So we're going to go back in time to 2010 and another serendipitous meeting with the very wonderful Marianne Gullberg. Marianne invited me to her lab at the University of Lund in Sweden to present some of the work that Gary and I had been doing on how hearing adults learn sign language. And like everyone who meets Marianne, I adored her the moment I met her. And when we met again at a conference in Amsterdam in 2013, over a very delicious Indonesian meal, we hatched a plan to work together. And what I proposed to Marianne is that we adapt a series of studies that she had done with Dutch speakers who were learning Mandarin Chinese. Now, what Marianne and her colleagues did in this study was they created a short weather forecast video presented in Mandarin. And Dutch speakers who knew no Mandarin at all sat down, watched and listened to this video, and after a few minutes they were tested on whether they'd learned any of the language in that video. Had they learned anything about Mandarin word forms, about Mandarin word meanings, about what a possible word in Mandarin could sound like? Now, it's actually a very difficult task because if you think about it, in most language classrooms, if we're starting off teaching a new language, we might chunk it up into words or short phrases. We might teach it very explicitly. But in Marianne's experimental situation, the language was presented as a stream of language, naturalistically, and people were not explicitly taught anything about the language. They were having to learn it implicitly. A very difficult task, but people could indeed learn something from this language input. And when I read about these studies, I had scientific envy, which has not happened to me many times during my career. But her work was just so elegant that I wish I'd thought about it myself. Anyway, I did the next best thing, which was to suggest to Marianne that we should adapt this set of studies to a sign language. And she said, yes, let's do it. So we did. And it's actually the only time in my career where I have had a 5-year plan for research, because we needed a short grant for me to go and visit Marianne in Lund in order to develop the experimental materials. And then Marianne and I and a very dear friend and colleague, Vicky Jank, wrote a 3-year grant to enable us to collect the data and analyse the data. So that was my 5-year plan for research. So our research question in this work was, can people who have never seen a sign language before, can non-signers on first exposure to a naturalistic sign stream, so on exposure to a signed weather forecast, can they learn anything at all about sign forms, about sign meanings, about what a possible sign might look like? Again, without being formally instructed in an implicit situation. And our predictions were, yes, it's going to be challenging, but iconicity will support learning. So I need to tell you a little bit about what iconicity is. Iconicity was a really hot topic in the cognitive and linguistic sciences when we started this work in 2013, and it still is a very hot topic. There was some suggestion that actually iconicity could support sign learning. So what iconicity is where the form of a word or a sign resembles the meaning in some way. So a lot of words are arbitrary in their mapping between form and meaning. Let's take an example, the English word sister. In the word sister, there is nothing sister-like about the sounds that make up the word sister. It's just an arbitrary label for that meaning. But if I give you a sign in Swedish Sign Language for rainbow, like this, I'll do it again. I'm sure you'll agree that the form of that sign brings to mind the meaning in some way, doesn't it? The sign has that arc shape, the fingers are drawing the colour bands of the rainbow. So the idea was that iconicity could help people to remember those links between form and meaning. There's a little bit of research that suggested that might be the case, but that was one of the things that we wanted to look at in our research. So what we did was to create a weather forecast in Swedish Sign Language, and we had 3 experimental tasks. So our participants, and we had a large group of more than 100 participants for each experimental task. One set of participants watched the forecast, and then they were presented with signs either that they had seen in the forecast or not seen in the forecast. And we asked them if they could distinguish between those. Could they identify signs that they had seen versus signs that they hadn't seen? So this is getting at sign form. And a second group of participants were shown signs from the weather forecast, and they were asked, have you learnt the meaning? What do you think this sign means? And a third set of participants were shown signs that they hadn't seen in the forecast, but some of those signs were real signs of Swedish Sign Language, and some of them could not be signs of Swedish Sign Language because they broke the rules of Swedish Sign Language phonology. So 3 different experimental tasks. Now of course, we created our weather forecast very, very carefully. There were target signs in that weather forecast that varied in terms of frequency. So some of the signs occurred very often in the forecast. They were high frequency signs. Other signs occurred much less frequently. They were low frequency signs. And we also manipulated the iconicity of the signs. So some signs were very high in iconicity, like the sign rainbow that I showed you. It was very clear what the meaning was. There were other signs where the meaning was a lot less clear. They were less iconic. So we manipulated sign frequency and iconicity. Now, what we found is that these people who'd never seen sign language before were indeed able to learn something in these really challenging circumstances from a continuous stream of sign language input. They were able to learn something about the forms and the meanings of signs. They were able to learn something about the lexical items. And they were particularly able to do this when the signs were highly frequent. I mean, that's not surprising. That's just a characteristic of learning, but it's good that we showed it. But they were also better able to learn those signs when those signs were highly iconic. However, what they were not able to do was to learn anything about the rules of sign phonology. They did not seem to be able to distinguish between those signs that could be a real sign of Swedish Sign Language and those that couldn't be. And we were puzzled initially by that. We have a few ideas, but if any of you think you know what's going on, please do come and speak to me afterwards. I'd like to know your opinions. Thank you. So coming up to date to 2023, what do we know about this topic nowadays? A little bit more than we knew in 2013. There is a growing number of researchers working in this field. Together with Krista Schönström at the University of Stockholm, we co-edited a special issue of the journal Language, Interaction and Acquisition, where we drew together some papers, some research on the topic of how adults learn sign languages. But we still do have a huge amount to learn in this area. And I think it's really, really important. This work does matter. It matters, before I get on to the practical applications, it matters theoretically. The field of second language acquisition is huge, but the vast majority of it is based on what we know from spoken language acquisition and written language acquisition. So that means that we don't know whether our theories of second language acquisition have good empirical coverage. We don't know whether they can account for sign language acquisition. Now, theories of second language acquisition need to be able to account for what we learn that's universal across languages and be able to account for what's specific across languages. So these data, this growing set of data, is really important for testing and developing theories of second language acquisition. But it also matters for practical reasons. And that's because the majority of deaf children's sign language input is from adults who, like me, have learned a sign language in adulthood, maybe parents of deaf children, teachers, communication support workers. And most of them, like all adult language learners, are going to go through a long period of not being particularly fluent and making lots of mistakes. And if we understand how adults learn sign languages, hopefully we can do a better job of teaching them so that the input that they in turn provide to deaf children will be of better quality. So that's why I think it matters. So I need to start to wrap up, and I'm going to go back to the beginning. Remember, I had intended to go back into the Montessori classroom when I finished my master's, but I didn't. But if I was to go back now, what have I learned in my 23 years of academia that I would take with me? What would be useful? What have I learned? Well, I think I would have a greater appreciation of 4 things. I would have a much greater appreciation of how variable language acquisition is. I mean, it's not surprising that I'd noticed that in the children in my class. But I now have a much better understanding of how biological and environmental factors can impact the trajectory of language development. And I have a much better understanding of when that variability matters and when it doesn't matter for learning. The second thing I would have a greater appreciation of is just how robust and yet also how fragile language acquisition is. So I agree with Steven Pinker that language is an instinct, and in that sense it's robust. But it is remarkable how many biological and environmental factors can delay children's language acquisition. The third thing I would have a greater appreciation of is just how important language is for other areas of development and learning. Language really is critical for healthy development, and it's critical for learning both inside and outside the classroom. And fourthly, I would have a much greater appreciation of the multimodality of language and communication. Language clearly occurs in different modes, in the spoken mode, the written mode, and there are sign languages. But in face-to-face communication, we draw on a lot of other resources to communicate meaning. We use hand gestures, we use eye gaze, we use head gestures. And those add information on top of language. And so I'd have a much better idea of how to use those resources to support the language development of the children in my class. And so the bottom line is that what I would do as a teacher is make sure that my class was as language rich, and indeed as rich in languages as it possibly could be. What now? What am I going to be doing in retirement? Well, I still don't have a 5-year plan. Apart from spending a lot more time with my partner, Pascal, what I am most looking forward to is not having a long to-do list. The pressures in academia are huge. And although I have enjoyed almost every single minute of it, I'm not going to be sad to leave those pressures behind. What I would like to do is continue with a line of work that I started a few years ago, and that's thinking about the evidence base for Montessori education. And in 2017, I took over as editor-in-chief of the journal First Language. And of all the academic roles I have, this is one that I've enjoyed almost the most. And I'm looking forward to spending more time on my editing work because I'm helping in some very small way to nurture the next generation of language acquisition researchers. So I need to wrap up by thanking you all for being here this evening, both here in person and on the live stream. I need to thank all of you who've supported me in my career. I truly appreciate it. And in a few moments, my dear colleague and friend, Professor Julie Dockrell, is going to come up to say a few words. And Julie, I've been at the IOE for 12 years, and in all that time, you have been so unwavering in your support, and you have provided such wise mentorship. Thank you for everything that you've done for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chloe. I hope you're all very impressed by that fascinating talk. Covers so many grounds, and certainly, on a personal note, brings me back to my days of working in the speech language therapy department. And of course, I remember the days when we were working on various projects. Most recently with Benzi, I think she's here, in Frank Barnes' School for Deaf Children. What really impresses me of your work, Chloe, if I may say so, as a linguist, is the fact that it's really linguistically informed. In fact, theoretically, linguistically speaking, theoretically really robust, and I think that is very, very important. As customary for professorial lectures here at the IOE, we now will hear a brief response, and on this occasion from our colleague, as Chloe already mentioned, Professor Julie Dockrell, who is Professor of Psychology and Special Needs. And Julie is a qualified educational and clinical psychologist. Her expertise is in patterns of language development and the ways in which oral language skills impact on children's learning. She was co-director of the largest UK study on the needs of children with language difficulties, the Better Communication Research Program, and is currently examining universal language support for nursery-age children in areas of social disadvantage. And she, of course, is also making a huge impact on the next generation of social scientists by leading the UCL Bloomsbury and East London Doctor Training Partnership for ESRC. Julie, over to you.
I think I need the mic. Thank you, Chloe, for asking me to do this. It's a real privilege to be able to say something. And one often starts responses of this kind by highlighting the significance, originality, and rigor of the work, words that are familiar to those of you who've been through the REF exercise. But Chloe's already done that. I hope you'll agree, so I don't actually have to do that. And if I start talking about H-index or impact factors of the journals she publishes in, well, I'm actually going to miss the point. But I would like to highlight something about Chloe's work, and that is how the research she has done crosses disciplinary boundaries. Now, you don't need to believe me, and Chloe would want me to show some data. And these data give you an idea of the diversity of disciplines according to one research, according to Web of Science, Chloe has published in. So we've got everything from experimental psychology, neurosciences, and linguistics. Yeah, it is pretty impressive. I thought that too. But when I was trying to capture Chloe's contributions in the attributes, I was reminded of a piece of artwork a Maisie student did some years ago when Chloe was directing the course. And for those of you who teach, you'll know what an honor this is for a student to have created individually a piece of work like that to thank Chloe, you know? And I think that really is quite unique. So you'll see our Maisie logo there. So I've sort of stolen the idea by using initials. And I want to talk to you about what makes Chloe a unique colleague, an original researcher, and an inspiring teacher. Well, she's creative, she's helpful, lots of laughter, couldn't do without that. She's open, and she's enterprising. So let me give you a few examples to take it forward. Okay, so Chloe is happy to engage in important questions even when others aren't necessarily receptive to that. And the Montessori is a particularly good example of that. Her research-based teaching is scientifically rigorous and intellectually challenging for students. She's helpful because she empowers colleagues. She's generous with her time. I couldn't count the numbers of hours we've spoken about problems that are related to work or other things. She cares about the student experience. So witness that Maisie student who took the time to create that unique piece for her. And in terms of laughter, well, anyone who encounters Chloe will be immediately taken in by her wonderful smile. And who couldn't say after work to share a glass of wine with Chloe, even if you really think you need to go home? So when it comes to open, there were lots of things I could use for open. I thought about organized, which is extremely organized, one of a kind, outstanding, but I think it's perhaps your openness to innovative ideas, to the opinions of others independent of the stage of career. Chloe listens to everybody. And most importantly, to the student's perspective. I know we're supposed to be open to the student's perspective, but that isn't always easy. She's enterprising. Her approach to online teaching during COVID, we were all pretty challenged with that, but Chloe certainly shook me up in getting the language development module right. The deaf awareness course she's doing for teachers that's coming up, and also for reinvigorating the Center for Language Literacy, Numeracy Research and Practice. It was getting a bit tired and old, and Chloe came in and gave it a really good shake. So I want to say thank you, Chloe, for being an excellent role model at the forefront of basic and applied science, a critical friend and colleague, and always listening and being there. To Chloe.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you again, Chloe, for that wonderful talk. That, I'm afraid, brings us to the end of our proceedings. Very special thanks to our BSL interpreters, Karen and Esther. We have to say goodbye to the colleagues who are online, attending the session online. Thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you all for a very good evening. And for those who are here, please continue the conversation and certainly talk to Chloe over a drink. Thank you.